Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. On behalf of the PG and Research Department of English, Heber College, we welcome you all for this faculty development program on contemporary literary theory. I now request the head of the department, Dr. Shobna, for the opening remarks.
Most welcome to the event, every one of you, avid participants, and especially Dr. Jinnah, who is online, accepting our invitation instantly, I would say. The next minute, he said, yes, ma'am. And so we're only extremely happy that he is with us today to share his knowledge with our students, researchers from other colleges and universities, and teacher friends. A huge thanks to you, sir, for that instant yes. And we're happy to share the online platform with you. It's because most of the time I watched him only making the session interactive and nothing else. What do you do? And interaction, of course, may be a difficulty in the online platform. Still, he means to interact as something that I'd like to let the audience know. Most welcome the participants from all over India, I would say. Around 700 or even more than that are registered for this FDP. An overwhelming response. We're pretty happy that the topics we thought about and more the people who will speak on those topics have made you to register in such a big number. We as an institution, Bishop Heber College, the Department of English, we mean to reach out as many students, researchers, and teacher friends as possible and share the platform with you all. Most welcome the participants and teacher friends from other colleges and universities. I'm reminded of William Ruckert's reflection on theories. Beginning, as I say, literature and ecology. The great eco-critic William Ruckert. He says that it's one thing to enjoy the plurality of literary theories that are coming up before you can even try to know what the theory is about. The theory is gone. There is another theory. Kind of a hybridization, kind of a shift over from one phase or one notch or one outlook on culture moves on to another outlook. It's a kind of a flux we are destined to live in, kind of a world of a culture of flux or changeover that we are living in. But he says, more than the syndrome of looking for newness of theory, it's the relevance of the theory to the social ethos around us, or the relevance to the theory to the social questions around us that matters most. And this is how it begins, that is, I still remember. And that has always made a big impact on me whenever I think of theory. And so with this kind of a note, I'm damn sure that the speakers of FDP, Dr. Jinnah, Dr. Bridget, and Dr. Laura, and all of them will work on that aspect, what social relevance a theory can make. And so we're happy once again that we're able to share this knowledge platform with the rest of the world. Welcome one and all, and thank you for your presence. Thank you very much, Dr. Jinnah, for your time and your heart, I would say. It's because your heart for the students is something inimitable. And so thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much.
Thank you, ma'am. It is with great pleasure that we welcome Dr. Abdul Muhammad Ali Jinnah, Associate Professor, Jamal Muhammad College, the speaker of today's FTP, which is titled An Insight into Crip Horror. We welcome you, sir. Next, I welcome the fellow participants, the faculty and research scholars from other colleges. I welcome our beloved principal, Dr. Paul Dayaparan, who strives to make sure that we succeed in every endeavor. I welcome Dr. Shobana, Head Department of English and Dean of Arts. This FDP is a brainchild. The organizing committee thanks you for the constant support. I welcome the advisory committee members, Dr. Suresh Frederick, UG Head and Dean of Research and Development, and Dr. Dhanapal, Coordinator, Shift 2, and Deanery of Training and Placement. Next, I welcome my colleagues, the organizing committee, and the participants from our college to this event. I thank the IT support for the arrangements made. Papers pertaining to the themes of the FDP are welcome. The papers should be sent before the end of May 2022. It will be published in our in-house magazine, The Literary Explorer. I've been bestowed with the honor of introducing the resource person of today. It gives me an exceptional pleasure in introducing Dr. Abdul Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who has 20 years of teaching experience and 12 years of research experience. Dr. Jinnah is a gold medalist from Central University at Pondicherry. He is a guest professor at the universities in Indonesia and has given special lectures in more than 100 national and international conferences in India and abroad. He is a member of the Gothic Association of New Zealand, Australia, and a reviewer of Common Ground Research Network, University of Illinois. Dr. Jinnah is a creative writer and has published flash fiction and horror narratives. He also offers creative writing course and is an academic consultant on writing Gothic fiction program in the University of Java. He is an ardent lover of pop culture, dread narratives, and post-human discourses, and specializes in literary theory and digital humanities. It's quite an honor for me to introduce Dr. Jinnah because he's my teacher, mentor, and guide. I was also given the task of introducing the topic of today's FDP, an insight into crip horror. Though I had learned about disability studies and knew something on the concept of horror, I couldn't possibly lay my hands on what is crip horror. So as always, it is better to get to know from Dr. Jinnah himself. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Suresh, for those warm words of welcome, and thank you, Dr. Shobana. In continuation of what Dr. Shobana said earlier, my heart and my time is always available for Bishop Heber College. Other than Jamal, I always consider Bishop Heber to be my second home, and I have always been very happy to visit the institution. Of course, now an offline visit appears to be quite impossible, at least in the near future. So at least, I get this opportunity to meet you guys, at least on the online mode. And hats off to you, of course, because you have attracted around 600 participants, I believe. It doesn't show just the brilliance of the resource persons. It also shows the greatness of the institution. Obviously, Suresh, you might not have got anything on crip horror because you can try Googling it out, and there are no entries for crip horror as of now. If you do, the only entry you would get is of Snoop Dogg, who has come up with an anthology that is called Tales from the Crypt. So other than that, crip horror is relatively new, very, very relatively new. In fact, I think this session would be the first session in which this is going to be discussed. So those of you who would like to do their research, in the future on crip horror, please do not forget to mention this particular FDP in which you came across this concept for the first time. Now, I think before we go on to what exactly is crip horror, we need to clear some basic misconceptions. The first thing is, why are we using this word crip? Because I think most of us would be more comfortable with the usage of the word disability studies, and not exactly this, because it has been entered into our minds that crip is a negative, a pejorative. It's something of insult towards people who are differently abled. Now, that is actually very true, because I think somewhere in the last century or so, the very word crip has always been used only with the reason. So whenever you point out someone as a crip, obviously you're making fun of them or you're insulting them. But when it began, I think the first use of that word crip was somewhere around 950 AD. It wasn't exactly a term of insult. It was actually a term which referred, to their physical handicap or, the way that they were physically challenged, the words that we use today. So when it comes to 21st century, or when it comes to the use of the term crip nowadays, you see it more as a kind of a reclamation. It's a kind of an appropriation. Now, when I use this term appropriation, obviously I'm appropriating it from Toril Moy, who said that, feminists needed to appropriate certain terms, slangs, or, sexual jargons in order to celebrate their femininity. So that is exactly the way you have to look at the use of the word crip here. So whenever we talk about crip literature or crip studies, it's kind of a reclamation. It's a kind of taking back, or maybe even a kind of speaking back to all those years and centuries of insults. So it's as if, saying, hey, we don't bother anymore. It's no longer an insult. It's actually a celebration of what we are. Of course, opinions are divided over here, because I think some of them would say that no, it is derogatory, so it always has to remain in the realm of that. It's just like, some of those words with these post-feminists try to appropriate all those words of derision earlier, which they try to appropriate and use it as a kind of a celebration. So that is exactly how you have to see the word crip. Now, the second question I think we need to answer, or the second misconception that we need to clear before we move ahead, what exactly does crip stand for? What is the image that comes to your mind when I use that word crip? I think it should be a stereotypical image of a person in a wheelchair, maybe, or a person with some kind of crutches, or maybe someone like Pistorius, the South African speedster, who uses those blades, So maybe that is a very contemporary way you envisage the word crip. But let me assure you that the definition of this word crip has become more broad-based today. It's no longer about only the physical handicaps or the physically challenged that you can kind of, that kind of jumps out in your mind. It's something more. It's a kind of an incorporation of so many different things put together. Let's kind of look at it this way. What exactly do we mean when we use this word crip? Or maybe let's keep this word aside for some time. What exactly do we mean by this word handicapped or challenged or differently abled? Now, whenever you use these kind of words, what we are doing is that we are centralizing a particular perception that is called the idea of ableism. Now, what do I mean by the idea of ableism is that we have this perfect bodies and we look upon all those not so perfect bodies vis-a-vis the perspectives we have of us. This is a very important quotation which I came across when I was just reading about crip theory. There is this journal which talks about the human body as a machine. A lot of people do that. But it goes on to say that if the human body is a machine, then every part of the body has to function properly. Like that is what we expect the machines to do, right? So if the human body is a machine, then every part of the human body needs to function perfectly and do the part that has been allotted to it. I've just put one part of the statement out there because the next part of the statement goes on to ask, so if that is so, then what is the necessity of disability studies at all? They say that disability studies is redundant. There is no need for those kind of studies because, hey, you have a handicap, you're out of the realm of humanity. Now, I'm sure you all assume that it might be a journal of the 18th century or the 19th century. No, my dear friends, this was a journal that was published. This was an article that was published in the journal in the year 1999. Just at the turn of the 21st century. So you see, perceptions don't change so fast. Preconceived notions, prejudices, they kind of are embedded in our minds, in our psyches, and they generally do not change very fast. You know, Jeremy Hawthorne talks about the concept of the gaze. Laura Mulvey extends it to the male gaze. I would like to extend this to the normal gaze. You know, the gaze of the normative, the body normative. What are the first things that come across your minds when you look at a differently abled person? Okay, fine. Stop the euphemism. When you look at a cripple, number one, of course, you have the feeling of pity. So you would like to empathize with them, sympathize with them, and probably offer them some money. And, you know, through the offering of that money or charity, you kind of assuage your minds and your hearts that, okay, fine, I've done a good deed. Or you look upon them as a figure of terror. Now, I'm going to expand on this further in the next slides that are going to come. So it's like Julia Kristeva talks about, you know, either the feminine as marginality, where she says that you either look upon a woman as a god, as the, you know, the mother, or you look upon her as the whore. So I don't know, somewhere down the line, humanity has kind of conjured up these kind of binary oppositions in which, hello? Okay, I think I have lost the, I'm sorry, I think I have lost the, can you give me just 1 minute?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes, sorry, I'm sorry, I've lost the PowerPoint. 1 second, please. Okay, is my PowerPoint visible?
Sir, your entire window is visible. Yes, sir. It's visible now.
It's visible now? Okay.
Yes, sir.
Fine. So the thing is, since I'm doing the PowerPoint now, you won't be able to see my faces. That's sad. I'll just continue. That is why I was presenting from another screen, but I don't know. That person has been denied access now. So moving on. I think I was trying to tell you about how, you know, throughout the ages, we have come up with this kind of a binary vision of anything that we consider as the other. So for crips, okay, we always see them as either representations of terror, or we see them as representations which are kind of capable of invoking pity in us. Or sometimes it is the sense of wonder, and that is exactly what they say is supercripism, where if you find a physically handicapped, or let's say physically challenged person doing any of those things which you would associate with normal life, you kind of look on them wonderstruck. And you kind of look on them as a miracle. That is what is called supercars. So that is why I mentioned Pistorius also. So when Pistorius is able to complete the 100 meters dash in quite a good time, we kind of look upon that as something that is very extraordinary. Now, this is exactly what disability studies is fighting against. Why do you stereotype us? Why do you consider us as something that are marginals? When are you going to give us our stage? When are you going to give us that center stage? So I think, my dear friends, that is the place where the entire ideology of crypt theory starts. And this term as such was first used by an academician and crypt theorist whose name is McRua, who in his book, he places the entire concept of crypt as an intersectionality. So he doesn't just talk about the marginalization of the disabled, he also looks at how they are in the confluence of other marginalities like gender, race, sexuality, and even class. Now, I know it is a bit of a bitter pill for us to digest, because we normally would not associate everything put together. And we would always like to see things in, neat little compartmentalizations, because that is how our mind works. But McRow says that it is not so. It's actually a confluence. It's actually, something that totally interconnects with the other. Now, take for example, the HIV or, the AIDS scare. Now, I think probably it's not a big thing, because most of us have gone beyond the fear of the HIV virus. But in the late 90s and the early the early part of the 21st century, it was a big thing, because everyone was scared of contracting AIDS. So AIDS is a disease, it's a disability. I'm sorry, it's a disease. But you know what? This entire fear of contagion that we had for AIDS was also kind of going hand in hand with our fear of the LGBTQ plus community also. So AIDS was something that was supposedly the curse of alternate sexuality. So we were kind of looking at both those things together. So this is exactly what McRow is also trying to hint at, because he says there's always this connection. The fear or the terror that you have for these kind of physically handicapped or the differently abled is always connected with something else. The fear of the other in some other sectionality or the other. So leprosy had a very, very class dimension attached to it. And what about TB? Consumption was earlier the hallmark of, let's say, the elite. But somewhere down the line, tuberculosis became the disease of the needy, of the destitute. So there was a class consciousness that was attached to these kind of diseases also. And going back to the question that I was trying to ask you earlier, what exactly is this crypt? Can I go back to that slide? Because I was trying to ask you, what exactly does this word crypt stand for? And I think the basic assumption is that whenever we use that word crypt, we are, conjuring up images of, those hand wheelchairs and hand crutches and stuff like that. But today, crypt is not that. Crypt is not just that. It's a kind of a broad umbrella term that kind of incorporates any disability. Now, this disability might be imagined or otherwise, because I think we have reached a stage in society where we can very easily and safely say that alternate sexualities are no longer considered to be disabilities. They are no longer considered to be congenital diseases. They are a way of being. They are a way of living. So that is what I meant when I used that word imagined. So what is CRIP? CRIP can be anything physiological. So you're physically challenged or your physical disabilities. It could be anything that is psychological. That is why there is so much of a cross current, they say, between CRIP studies and MAT studies. It can be something that is sensory also. And all these learning associated diseases, disorders are also something that come under the concept of CRIP. So what is CRIP? Is there a boundary to which we can kind of categorize this term CRIP? My dear friends, no. Any kind of a disorder, any kind of a disability can come under this. So let's say, the kind of disorders that we talk about today, the contemporary disorders. I'm using this word contemporary because they are much more in vogue and fashion now. We talk about them more. For example, disorders like OCD or ADHDs, they also come under the broad categorization of CRIP today. Let's have that in our minds. And moving on, since we have already located 3 of the ways in which they are stereotyped, the terror, the pity, and then the super CRIP, let's go into the strange institution of literature. I think this is something that is very pertinent for us because we know how stories create personalities or how stories create what we are. So just imagine the kind of growing up stories that we had. I think we all might have enjoyed the stories of Peter Pan or Treasure Island or many of our fairy tales. But in retrospect, just have a look at it and you will find that you would have a lot of disabled characters who would either play the villains, who would be the villains, or who would be the characters on the sidelines, characters without any kind of an agency. Are you able to connect with that? So Peter Pan, okay, fine. The main villain of Peter Pan might be a crocodile, but then you had Captain Hook, the bad Captain Hook. And why exactly is he Captain Hook? Because he does not have a hand, he does not have a limb. He has a hook in its place. Or can we ever forget Long John Silver? The great villain of Treasure Island, and then obviously we would be associating him with the crutch, the one-handed crutch on which he travels. What about the disability of dwarfism that is discussed in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs? Everywhere we find that there are these characters who are very literally, they are thrown into the narratives, but their presentations are highly problematic. You understand the point when I say that these are problematic characters, presentations, characterizations, and it is through this that we grew. So no wonder that our associations with the CRIP characters has always been very negative, very toxic. And then we grow, and then we enter into classics. And what do we see there? We see Jane Eyre, and then we see the classic case of Bertha Mason. You remember the first description of Bertha Mason in that novel? You will be shocked that she is almost bestial in her description. Now, what exactly is Charlotte Bronte trying to tell us? And remember, Bertha Mason has a certified mental disorder. She's a pyromaniac. And within the context of that novel, she is presented as the main villain. Which, of course, Joris tried to kind of reconstitute in White Sargasso Sea, but not to the extent success was achieved as, Jane Eyre had. And then, of course, our great Gothic stories, Frankenstein, the Frankensteinian monster, the freak of nature. I would say it was Victor Frankenstein who's the villain, not the monster. The monster is something that has to be pitied. He always reminds me of the Rakshasas that we come across in our own stories. People who are different are always stock characters of villainy or fun. And what about the whole concept of vampirism? When Bram Stoker or Byron or Dr. Polidori, when they created the vampire, they created it as, as morbid characters, supernatural villains. But today, vampirism is considered to be a disorder. I mean, not the kind of vampires which you find in literature or on celluloid. Vampirism is a disorder. It's a disease. Moby Dick, Captain Ahab, he's missing a leg. And what about that tragic character of the hunchback, Victor Hugo? He's deformed. Why is it that literature always has to demonize the physically challenged characters? And let's move more mainstream. I'm sure we all enjoyed reading the stories of Sherlock Holmes, but in how many of those stories of Sherlock Holmes do you come across the villains who are physically deformed, stunted, missing a foot, a twisted lip, albinos? Okay, the albino might not have been a villain, but he comes across as a character without agency. Even Cormac McCarthy, for all his, postmodern tendencies, creates the character of Judge Holden in probably his magnum opus, that is Blood Meridian. And Judge Holden happens to be an albino. Thomas Harris, the creator of the immortal Hannibal Lecter, in the other novel of his, Red Dragon, he creates a villain, a serial killer, Francis Dolarhyde, who has a physical deformity. Bateman in American Psycho creates a serial killer who is a paranoid. I can go on and on. How about all those movies we have grown up enjoying, or those movies which we enjoy today? How many of these supervillains, how many of these negative characters are disabled? Just have a look. And if you are talking about slasher movies, the three great slasher movies, the three iconic characters of slasher movies, every one of them is deformed. So if it is Jason Voorhees of Friday the 13th, he has a deformity. He's a freak. If it is Freddy Krueger, he has been burnt. His body is burnt. And Mike Myers, he's a psychopath. Now, if you consider literature as an institution that kind of is a part of our culture, it be it pop culture or, our traditional culture, then you have to definitely lay the blame on literature, because it has, as I said earlier, it has shaped us. It has shaped our notions of these people. So I hope I was able to reach into your minds. So I think it's the right time to do a little bit of a warming up here. This is one kind of horror. That is the horror of depiction. The way they are depicted. It's the horror of representation. It's the horror of our perception. So which means that we seriously need to rethink what is happening over here. We seriously need to rethink our perceptions of how we see these people and how we marginalize these. So if Gillian Weir talks about, from representation to representation, I think that is exactly what we have to arrive at here. We need to kind of represent these characters, and probably look at them in a different light. So having established that, having tried to explain away the misconceptions in that field, let's move to another field which has always been marginalized. Horror. The genre of horror has always been marginalized. It's always been on the fringes of literature. But thankfully, in the last 50 years or so, it is trying to reclaim its place. It's trying to claim its place. I know, still, there are a lot of highbrows among us who would say that no, horror is not to be discussed seriously. But I think that's a kind of a fallacy. I think it's time we talk horror. It's time we break the stereotype of horror, because horror has changed. That's why I never like to call it horror. I would personally call it a dread narrative. Why? I would tell you. Because horror is not the macabre or the eerie or the supernatural or the gothic, which we used to kind of associate with people like, let's say, M.R. James or even Coleridge for that matter, or someone like Sheridan Le Fanu. No, horror has changed. It's no longer, about just clanking chains or, the woman in white who glides or the ghost who comes across in our peripheral vision first. Horror is not just the Conjuring type. Rather, I would like to look at horror in a very Eliottian way, because when in The Wasteland, Eliot says that I can show you fear in a handful of dust. I think that's horror. Because Eliot was kind of trying to epitomize the fear of death that is so inherent in us. The fear of what is going to happen to me. I don't even think that it is just the fear of death per se. I think it's more the fear of the unknown, because, okay, after I die, what happens? What is going to happen to me? It's not just a theologically inclined question. Sometimes it's just a fear. It's a question that just, kind of manifests our fear. So the fear factor. So horror can be anything that can make you fear. Horror can be anything that kindles that hidden fear, that suppressed fear in you, and probably does not make you sleep, maybe. That's fear, and that's horror. Horror is found in everyday things. For example, one of my stories is about the horror of the OCD. Now, that is a story I would say is a very 21st century horror story, horror tale, because I think that's what we fear today. The fear of disgust, the fear of dirt, the fear of something that is nasty. So, taking both those things together, the idea of crypt and the idea of a newfound horror. Let's mix them together, and we come across this nomenclature that is crypt horror. Now, I'm not punning over here. I'm not playing with words. When I say it's not the horror of the crypt or the crypt of horror. When I use that term, the horror of the crypt, obviously I'm harking back to the stereotype which I had told you in a previous slide, the kind of terror that we have of the crypt. Or if I put it the other way around, it's not just the crippled or the differently abled which you find in conventional horror. Crypt horror is something that kind of moves beyond that. It's a kind of a foregrounding, not the backgrounding, not placing it in the marginal or placing it somewhere in the slipstream. It's basically the foregrounding of the disabled character. The foregrounding of the disabled character in their different variations, in their different manifestations, and in their different varieties. So what happens is the story becomes incidental. The character becomes preeminent. Now, when I say this, obviously I am echoing the words of Zvitan Todorov, who, when he talked about the detective story, he said that the first crime might be incidental, but the next crime, now when I'm talking about the next crime, he's talking about the crime of society, the crime that society fails to acknowledge the marginals or the other. That, he says, is something that is very preeminent. That is primary. So when you read, for example, a story like Agatha Christie, which again, we have enjoyed reading, the jouissance that we have got out of the denouement, I'm sure all of us have enjoyed that. But hidden within that is the kind of racism that Hercule Poirot has to face, is the kind of racism that Agatha Christie keeps exhibiting very overtly. The fear of the foreigner, xenophobia. It might come across as very tongue-in-cheek, maybe in the novels, in the narratives, but they are not tongue-in-cheek. They're not. They're very overt. So that is the real crime, according to Todorov. That is the real crime. The crime which society kind of oppresses or forces upon the individual. Similarly, that was an example. Similarly, when in horror literature, when we find that these characters are always given the designation of the marginal or of the supervillain or of the person who is responsible for that, the horror in it, then, my dear friends, I think we need to have a problem. And that is exactly what crypt horror tries to address. That is the lacunae that crypt horror is trying to, overcome. So are there any? There are a lot. Now, what I am trying here is a kind of mainstreaming of the marginal. So please do kindly bear with me, because I know there might be so many among you who might not find these as literary writers. But what constitutes literary? Is a very problematic question, if you ask me. I mean, I always like to say that, the one to whom the Nobel Prize was accorded, Ernest Hemingway, was once considered a bestseller. He was considered a mainstream writer. He was never considered to be a literary writer. But then, he evolved, or maybe our perception of him evolved, and then he went on to win the Nobel Prize. So that is one way in which I think we need to have a look at this. So maybe I am presenting for you, for some of you, these might be writers, storytellers whom probably you have not come across much. But I think it's high time that you took them up, because they are people who, under the garb of writing, let's say, horror, are also able to incorporate all these hitherto disadvantaged communities within the scope of their narrative. So one of my personal favorites is, of course, Stephen King. King is a voluminous writer, so that goes both to his advantage and his disadvantage, because many people say that if he is able to write, let's say, a novel a year, how do we even take him seriously? But believe me, he's a great writer. There are certain places where King is able to wring out emotions from you. There are certain places where his depictions are absolutely universal. So, hey, if you're looking at these as the parameters on which you locate literariness, then he has it. And sometimes he can be so meta. I like that about him. And for me, one of his best novels is a novel called Misery, which was also made into a movie. Most of his novels have been adapted into movies, into the silver screen. And one of the best adaptations, of course, is this novel. As I said, it's a very meta novel. It's a novel about an alcoholic writer who meets with an accident, and he is, bedbound, and he falls under the clutches of a super fan, or let's call it a rabbit fan, the fan from hell. And she kind of, likes one of his series, that is Misery. And, what happens to this writer when he's caught up in bed, or, handicapped, or he is a crip. Because earlier he is a crip, and then she deliberately, breaks his knees. So it's a horrific novel. Now, the horror here is the horror of being confined to a solitary space. There are other elements of horror which you find over here, but Stephen King creates the paranoia of being confined to the bed. I think that's a real horror. If you're up and going and sprightly, and suddenly you find yourself on the bed for the rest of your life. I mean, life is a misery here. So how exactly does the mind of a person who is caught up in the horror of confinement, that I think is the major focus of that novel. Or Silver Bullet, which is basically the story of a werewolf. But here, the hero, or the one who is going to kill the werewolf with the silver bullet, is not a macho man with a six-pack, 6 feet. No, it's a young boy, a physically challenged boy, a boy on a wheelchair. Or Carrie, which is basically talking about, it's a body horror. It's one of the first examples of body horror where a woman's fear of menstruation is actually exemplified in the character of Carrie. All these have been made into movies. So if you're not interested in reading the narrative, I strongly advocate that you have to read the narrative. But in case you're not okay with reading those narratives, please watch the movies. They're great. Or someone like Clive Barker, again, a great horror writer, who is able to use all these differently abled people in his narratives. He has a huge collection of short stories that is called the Books of Blood. I think there are 6 volumes of the Books of Blood. Short stories, anthologies, each of those volumes. But these are anthologies which kind of foray into every subgenre of literature. Of horror. There's not a horror trope that he has not touched upon. That makes him a genius. And I know many of you would not agree with the fact that, George R.R. Martin's creations are horror. No, technically they are not horror. They are more of fantasy, of a combination of the utopia, dystopia, trope which you find in fantasy literature. But there are many elements in that stories which you find are absolutely relative to horror. And what I love about George R.R. Martin's creations is the character of, that Lannister. Tyrion Lannister. I think that was a fantastic way of looking at dwarfism, which always has been relegated, as I said, either to comic characters, comic stock characters, or characters who are not worthy at all. Hark back to all those Tamil movies or Hindi movies that you have seen, where these are characters who are always stock characters. But Martin is able to give us a very strong character. And then, of course, we have Jeffrey Deaver, his Lincoln Rhyme series, in which he's a forensic expert, a former police officer. His name is Lincoln Rhyme. And now, because of paralysis, he is confined to the wheelchair. He's a quadriplegic. But that doesn't stop him from being the foremost forensic scientist in the country. He's able to do that. And somewhere, as a part of the story, we have the actual life of a person spending his entire day and night sometimes in the wheelchair. What do they undergo? What are the physical problems that they undergo? What are the psychological problems that they undergo? How are they able to overcome their depressions? These are the things that make up the fabric of that stories. So on one hand, you have, a serial killer, but this serial killer is a normalized man. Now that is exactly where the reversal comes up. The villains become the normalized humans, people like you and I. And the heroes, they are the people whom we actually place on the marginal. They are the differently abled. They are the people who become the heroes. So that's exactly how crypt horror needs to work. It's not to show the crypt as a horror figure. It's to show the crypt as the hero, the crypt as the protagonist, the crypt as the central character around whom the story is going to revolve. And this, Aquake MSG's modern fairy tale. It's called Pet, but the pet is not a very cute dog or a cat. It's actually a monster that comes out of the painting one fine day. And it takes over that household. Now, at the end of the novel, you're always going to have a question: who exactly is the pet? Is it the monster, or is it the boy who calls himself the master? A very interesting take on most of our fairy tales, like, for example, Beauty and the Beast, where the beast has to be humanized. And this humanization happens because of a kiss, or, the love that is shared between Beauty and, the animal. This is a reversal of that. And then there are, these two books. One is Graham Masterton's Blind Panic. And then, of course, you have Jose Saramago's Blindness. Both are apocalyptic novels that deal with one of the basic fears of humanity, that is the fear of going blind. Now, Saramago, of course, creates a hugely realistic depiction of how blindness can affect us. But out of the, how do I say, the tribulations of blindness, rise the unlikely heroes who are able to lead them towards some kind of light. I'm using this word light in a very euphemistic manner. There's no light at the end of the tunnel. But these are the people who are leading them forward. There are so many others which probably, you can look up. For example, there is this writer called Dean Koontz who always looks at the idea of autism. So many of his central characters happen to be autistic persons. Now, autism obviously brings me to two other novels which I have not taken up here. One is Mark Haddon's The Curious Case of the Dog, The Curious Incident of the Dog at Nighttime, which is about an autistic boy who becomes the detective. And then there is Jonathan Safran's novel. I forgot the name of that novel. Jonathan Safran's novel. I forgot the name of the novel. It was, yeah, extremely loud and incredibly close. It deals with the horror of terrorism and how this boy, this young boy, this adolescent is not able to cope up with that, who also happens to be autistic. You know, the social prejudice of infrequent. That you find in these two novels. One is Hans and the other is Thinner. Thinner is by Stephen King and Hans is by his son, Owen King. And I would also like to look at this one particular novel, which is basically considered to be a chicklet. You know, it's a rom-com. Bridget Jones' Diary. Some of you might have read that. Some of you might have seen the movie and probably had a shared laugh over it. But I don't think it's a laughing matter at all, because it deals with certain bodily problems. It's a body horror, if you ask me. Like anorexia or bulimia or obesity, which are 21st century problems. These are definitely not, you know, things that have to be laughed about. Ask anyone who is above, you know, the normal BMI and concerned about it, and you will find that it's not something to be laughed about. So, though we might technically call it romantic comedy, it's a comedy at the expense of, I would call it body shame in some way or the other. So my friends, I'm trying to give you a whole new dimension of that word horror. Please do not look at it in a very conventional way. Look at it differently. Try to think outside, you know, the box of literature or the box of, you know, literariness, and you'll understand that crip horror is actually a very exciting realm, not just for research, mind you, also for creativity. I think we need to take this in our stride, that a study of literature in today's times, it's not just about, you know, the sense of analysis or the sense of research. It's not just a study. I think it's about something that has to prepare us for creativity. Prepare us to narrate stories, come up with stories, and use our imaginations to pen down our thought processes in a more creative channel. So, as a way of conclusion, I think what we need to do today in the age of inclusivity is that we need to change our body and mind processes. We need to rethink many of our conventional ideas about how society is or how society should be. It's about us giving up this, you know, this preconceived notion, a cultural notion, a notion that has come through nurture of ableism, and try to embrace disability, because I think the question is, which among us is not a disabled? Who isn't disabled? In some way or the other, I think we are disabled. As I said, please do not think of disability in terms of, you know, the crutches or the wheelchair or the white cane. It's beyond that. Okay, so thank you so much. It was wonderful talking to you people, and let me confess that these are ideas which kind of came to my mind and kind of shaped me only after I started researching on this. So some of them might be very new, some of them might be not so fantastic, but they are there. Yeah, that's my point. Thank you. I'm open to questions. Yes.
Thank you so much, sir,
Thank
for
you.
your insights on disability, crip horror. We have some questions here.
Sure.
Fascinated to know new realm of literary study. Is there any channel, page, site to read Abdul sir's lectures on the topic of crip horror?
Maybe I'll create a channel very soon. Thank you for that. I'm honored. Maybe
Yes,
I'll
sir.
create a channel very soon for that.
Okay, sir. The next question, sir. Has the concept of disability changed through the years?
Disability hasn't changed through the years. So the concept of disability is obviously not going to change. But I think what is changing is our perception of disability. I think that should be the question. Okay, if you read someone like Foucault in his history of sexuality, where he talks about disability as queer, okay? He does talk about the invisibility of queers. In The Birth of the Clinic, he talks about how disability is also an invisibility. So from invisibility, those were times when the disabled were not even allowed to move out of their homes. They were kept relegated into the homes or hospices or mental asylums or, the so-called clinics. So from invisibility, what happened is they have moved to a kind of a visibility. But this visibility was not something that was very productive for them, because visibility brought them to a social consciousness which kind of was very distasteful. Society did not like them out there. So that is where, all those pejoratives and, all those stereotypes, they started being propagated. But now, okay, in contemporary times, I think, okay, it doesn't change fully, but I think there is a very conscious change. And I think the change has to come from us. Basically, it has to come wholeheartedly from us, because we are the avant-garde, right? We should be the beginning of every change. So it should come from us. And this question, maybe in some other time when someone asks, I think I should be able to tell it in a very forceful manner that yes, concepts, perceptions have changed. Let's hope for that.
Thank you so much, sir. It was a wonderful session as always, sir. It was good, nice listening to you.
Thank you.
I wanted to tell you that when I was reading disability studies for a project, I happened to get all these concepts which you mentioned bits by bits and pieces, but now it's very clear, sir. And it started off with Oedipus Rex, because Oedipus means stolen food, and he commits a very heinous crime. So the disabled as the villain, the disabled, and the next when we looked into certain literature, the disabled as the victim, and of course, as you pointed out, disabled as the hero, as you pointed out in Lincoln Rhyme and other novels. So it was very clear, sir. Thank you so much for the insight you have given us on crip horror. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful. Thank you.
Yes, sir. For the participants, the feedback link is posted, and those who have joining via YouTube, the feedback link for day 1 is posted. It will be sent to your mail for today alone. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.